Hey guys, tonight we're headed somewhere unusually quiet. Not just library quiet. Not even rural, distant mooing of a cow quiet. This is the kind of quiet that feels like the air itself is holding its breath. You're standing at the edge of a mist-covered valley, somewhere in northern Europe. The trees creak softly. The wind hums low, weaving through the crooked chimneys of a town that doesn't appear on most modern maps. And at the heart of it all, a cemetery where no one lies down. Every grave is vertical. Every soul is, quite literally, still on their feet. That's right. You found the quiet town that buried its dead upright. You probably won't survive this place. Not because it's dangerous, but because you'll simply fall asleep before anything happens. That's how slow and weirdly cozy this story is. Nothing jumps out at you here, except maybe a well-dressed skeleton politely leaning at a slant. And even that's probably just poor maintenance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Midnight in Texas? 2:14 a.m. in Manila? I love seeing the sleepy corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge up the soft grassy slope of the valley, damp earth muffling each step. The path winds around sheepfolds, crumbling stone fences, and a single rusted sign in a language you probably don't speak. Even if you could, the paint's peeled too far to make out anything useful. There's no paved road here. The buildings you pass look like they were constructed by someone who didn't quite trust the 20th century. Or the 19th, honestly. And then, you see it. The cemetery sits on a gentle hilltop, ringed by twisted iron fencing. But unlike any burial ground you've seen, there are no rows of headstones. Instead, there are slightly sunken rectangles in the grass, each marked by a wooden plaque that's been nailed to a post. And behind each plaque is a subtle bulge, a vertical shape pressed into the soil, about the height of a human being. You do the math quickly. They didn't bury them lying down. They buried them standing up. A low fog brushes past your ankles, swirling around the markers. You hear the faint clink of something metallic in the distance. Possibly the old bell in the church tower. Or maybe it's just your keys jingling nervously in your pocket. Either way, the silence is respectful, not eerie, just waiting. Standing burials aren't unheard of, technically. History records the occasional eccentric aristocrat or defiant warrior requesting to be buried upright, often to face their enemies or watch over their people. But this village made it a tradition. As you walk among the markers, something oddly tender catches your eye. Many of the plaques are hand-painted in fading hues: cornflower blue, mustard yellow, gentle lilac. Some have little carvings: a tiny hammer, a teacup, a dog with comically large ears. They're not trying to impress anyone here. These are quiet symbols of everyday lives. One plaque simply reads, "Marta, knitter, laughed at funerals." You can't help but smile. Downhill, the houses lean inward like they're gossiping. Their windows are small and round, like eyes squinting against the fog. No neon lights, no traffic hum. Only a single orange glow in one window, perhaps a candle or a wood stove. The whole town moves like syrup. Back in the cemetery, the burials are organized, but not in a grid. They follow the slope of the land like polite party guests, each grave slightly turned toward the church on the far end of the hill. Some locals still leave offerings at the foot of the plaques: lavender bundles, hard candies in rustling wrappers, even a weathered paperback novel or two. You reach down and brush a smooth stone off one offering. It's an old harmonica. The name on the grave behind it is simply Leo. Didn't quite learn the harmonica. You exhale. This isn't a place of horror. It's a place of strange, upright peace. Mainstream historians mostly ignore this town. It's too small, too inconvenient to research. But one dusty monograph, written in the 1970s by a bored linguistics professor who came here for unrelated reasons, mentions that the tradition may date back to at least the early 1600s. He theorized it might have started with a single family. Maybe one grieving mother who couldn't bear to see her son laid down, looking asleep when he wasn't. That's the romantic version. There's also the fringe idea that the villagers believed standing burial helped the soul ascend more directly. Like elevator logic, but for the afterlife. And yes, historians still argue whether this was purely symbolic, or whether there were deeper religious or cosmological beliefs at play. Some say it was just tradition, no different than singing a lullaby out of habit. Others insist it's a sign the villagers expected to be called back. Whatever the reason, the result is quietly astonishing. You move between the markers slowly, almost as if walking through a crowded room of very polite ghosts. Your footsteps are muffled, not just by the grass but by the thick stillness that saturates the air. No one speaks here. No one has to. The dead are on their feet. And for tonight, so are you. You kneel beside one of the graves, half expecting the ground to feel warmer than it should. It doesn't. It's damp and cool, the way undisturbed earth usually is. The name on this wooden plaque is Elspeth, wore red to weddings and funerals. There's a faded red ribbon tied around the stake. It flutters slightly in the wind, almost in sync with your breath. Something about these people, these upright villagers, starts to feel less like a historical oddity and more like a quiet resistance, a refusal to lie down, a choice, deliberate and stubborn, to remain on their feet even when all motion has ceased. Maybe that's why you like them. They're a little weird, but they stick to their principles. Now let's talk about the shoes. It's one of those delightful historical details that would make any museum label instantly more interesting. Many of the buried were dressed in full footwear, boots, clogs, even dainty leather slippers. Why? No one knows for sure. Some think it's practical. After all, if you're going to be standing for eternity, you'll want good support. Others think it was symbolic, ready to walk into the next life, or perhaps out of the grave if Judgment Day ever showed up late. One fringe theory even suggests the shoes were a subtle insurance policy. If a loved one returned in spirit, they'd leave tracks. Muddy footprints on the kitchen tiles. Time to light a candle. No footprints. The dead are still minding their own business. Of course, this isn't unique to this town. In certain regions of Central Europe, grave goods like footwear were common, especially during the early modern period. But pairing shoes with upright burial? That's rare. Uncomfortably rare. In fact, this village might be the only place that made it normal. You brush dirt from another plaque. Tomasz. Never danced. Still hasn't. You chuckle, realizing even the dead here get one last joke. The humor's subtle but persistent. Another reminder that these people weren't morbid. Just practical. There's a legend that goes something like this. One stormy spring, a local farmer buried his brother standing up because the rain had flooded the lower half of the family plot. The gravedigger shrugged and did it anyway, wedging him upright between two planks to hold him steady. Years later, it turned into an inside joke. If you can't lie down straight, stand tall and haunt better. That probably isn't how it started, but it feels right, doesn't it? You notice something else now. The graves don't all face the same direction. While many turn toward the church, a few seem to face personal landmarks. A corner bakery, the old bridge, a cottage that no longer exists except in outline. One grave even points due west, toward the wooded ridge outside town. Its plaque reads, Toma. She always watched the forest, curious. There are no formal records in English of the upright tradition being codified here. No decrees or town ordinances. But oral histories passed between generations, shared over soup, whispered during long winters, suggest that the people simply stopped lying their dead down after a certain point. Maybe one generation saw it happen once and thought, that's actually quite nice. And then it became custom. And as with many customs, over time, no one questioned it anymore. You imagine how it must have looked, digging those narrow pits, a little wider than a person's shoulders, a little deeper than a grave should be. Wooden braces to hold the body upright. Cloth padding. Some say they even stitched the eyes closed with lavender thread, as if to offer peace without surrender. Sounds fake, but hey, historians still argue whether that detail was a local practice or just a romantic flourish added in the 1800s by an overly poetic parish priest. One theory suggests this burial style was a kind of posthumous protest, perhaps against being forgotten, perhaps against falling into a horizontal anonymity that traditional graveyards often bring. When you're standing, even in death, you're more noticeable. Less like a name among many, more like a person still present. The shoes, then, become more than shoes. They're a metaphor, and possibly orthopedic. You keep walking. The wind shifts. A bell chimes softly from the church tower. Not a full ring. Just a sigh. A reminder. The church, of course, is central here, both spiritually and literally. Its spire watches the town like a patient sentinel. Some locals used to believe the bell's sound stirred the dead, not in a zombie apocalypse kind of way, but in a better straighten your coat sort of way. Keep it classy, even underground. In one old woman's diary, translated clumsily in a 1934 folio, she recounts how, as a child, she was told never to whistle near the graves at night. Not because it was dangerous, but because you don't want to interrupt their listening. Listening to what? That was never explained. You find a newer grave, unusually polished. The plaque reads, Henrik, retired early, watched geese, died standing. There's a goose feather wedged into the post, either an offering or an act of avian vandalism. You decide to believe it's meaningful. So, here you are, surrounded by people who've been standing longer than you've been alive. People with shoes on their feet, stories in their bones, and a town that never saw the point of lying down. It doesn't feel eerie. It feels oddly supportive, like the earth itself is holding them up, not out of necessity, but out of respect. You pause for a moment on a mossy bench just outside the cemetery gate. It's lopsided, and the wood creaks under your weight, but that somehow fits. Nothing in this village seems especially eager to be level, or quick. Time here meanders, like a cat with nowhere to be. Now let's tackle one of the oldest rumors, that people were buried upright because the town ran out of space. Sounds logical, right? A standing grave takes up less land than a traditional one. Efficient, tidy. Except, that's not what happened. You glance around. This valley isn't short on space. The hills roll out gently on every side, covered in meadows and sheep trails. If anything, the town has too much land. The kind of open space that makes you whisper without meaning to. There's room here to lie down, sit, sprawl. But they didn't. They chose to stand. And here's where things get interesting. The earliest church records, written in brittle Latin with ink that's now a gentle rust, show plenty of plots marked for horizontal burials in the 1400s and 1500s. Whole families were buried lying down with meticulous records. Uncle this, aunt that. The merchant who sneezed too loud. They were all laid flat. So what changed? That's where the story splinters. Some say the standing burials started not because of land, but because of landslides. Yes, landslides. One especially wet spring reportedly caused part of the cemetery slope to slip slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a slow ooze of soil. It didn't unearth anyone, but it tilted a few headstones and sent local imaginations into overdrive. One popular tale claims that after the slide, 3 graves ended up almost vertical anyway, and someone said, well, maybe that's the way to do it from now on. Half joke, half solution. Fringe historians love this theory. It's tidy and fits with the town's low-key fatalism. But more skeptical scholars argue there's no geological evidence of any landslide. The slope is stable, the earth compacted. No one's found skeletal remains at an angle that would suggest post-burial movement. And so the debate continues. You rise from the bench and follow a narrow footpath that arcs around the far side of the cemetery. Here, the graves are older, less maintained. Some of the markers have fallen or faded into blankness. But even without names, you can feel the posture of the dead beneath you. They're upright, quietly alert. The ground here hums, not with noise, but with memory. You imagine the funerals. A wooden frame lowered into a deep, person-sized shaft. The body, clothed and shod, gently braced with slats and linen. Then, filled in with care. Maybe flowers were tossed in. maybe a joke was told. One villager reportedly requested a deck of cards in his hand and a mirror on his chest, so he could check his look when judgment came. You try not to picture how that mirror looks now. Another theory, a bit more philosophical, posits that standing burials were meant to reflect vigilance. That even in death, one should remain ready, aware. Some scholars compare it to warrior cultures, where burial posture reflects honor. In Norse tradition, some chieftains were buried seated, ready to rise. In this town, they skipped the seat. But not everyone agrees this had anything to do with honor. There's a competing belief that upright burial symbolized penance, that to lie down was a luxury reserved for the guiltless. If you died with sins unresolved, or debts unpaid, you stood, as if waiting your turn. The cue of the quiet. Sounds poetic, maybe even medieval, but records from the parish don't support a strong link between sin and burial position. No mentions of judgment-based sorting. Still, the theory lingers in the margins of obscure academic papers and late-night folklore blogs. You reach a clearing, where the grass has grown higher. In the center, a particularly tall plaque lists only 2 words: still waiting. No name, no date, no embellishment. It's a little spooky. Not in a horror movie way, but in the what did they mean by that way. You start to wonder whether the living in this village feared forgetting, or being forgotten. The town's collective memory is woven into these graves. Every marker, every shoe, every awkward pun chiseled into wood is part of a broader fabric. They didn't just bury people, they kept them included. Even the dead have a presence, a direction to face, a place in the town's geometry. And here's a fun tidbit. An anthropologist who visited in the 1920s noted that many of the standing graves had small stones placed directly behind the skull position. Just a palm-sized rock, about 6 inches deep. No one knew why. The locals claimed it was for balance, which sounds like a joke, but maybe it wasn't. The anthropologist wondered whether it served a ritual purpose, perhaps anchoring the spirit, or maybe someone just didn't want the heads to loll. Historians still argue whether that little stone was symbolic, structural, or entirely imagined. But whether the reasons were spiritual, practical, or charmingly nonsensical, the effect remains the same. You can't help but feel watched. Not in a menacing way. More like a grandmother peeking out the curtains. Someone who wants to be part of the conversation, even if they've long since stopped speaking. And that brings us to the final theory for tonight. No one ever really leaves this town. Even if they do, their story loops back. Their spot on the hill is waiting, standing room only. So you tuck your hands into your coat, glance once more at the horizon of silent, upright neighbors, and start heading back toward the village. They'll still be here tomorrow, and the next day, and long after. You wander downhill now, away from the hilltop cemetery, shoes picking up bits of dew-laced grass and soft gravel. The path curves, and ahead of you rises the church tower, tall, square, and stubborn against the mist. Its stones are weathered, but not crumbling. The kind of building that doesn't look like it was built, but rather just always there. The bell is the first thing you notice. Not ringing, not tolling, just present. An immense, rust-haloed bell hangs inside the belfry, motionless, but impossibly heavy-looking. They say the bell only rings during funerals, and always just once. One long, low note that fades into the valley like a sigh too tired to be heard twice. And the church itself? It's oddly modest. No stained glass, no high arches, just whitewashed stone, a sharply sloped roof, and a wooden door with a worn brass handle polished smooth by centuries of Sunday hands. You step inside. The air is cool, dry, and faintly scented with something like beeswax and lavender. Maybe from old candles or decades of hymnals that haven't been opened in years. The pews are short and boxy. Some even have cushions sewn from old potato sacks. There's no gilded altar, no towering crucifix. Just a painted wooden symbol on the wall that looks vaguely like a compass rose. But it's the layout that really catches your eye. The pews don't face forward. They face inward, arranged in a tight oval like chairs around a fireplace. No one at the front. No one above or below. This isn't a church built for sermons. It's built for watching. A quiet kind of community. Or surveillance. depending on how tired you are. You find a little guest book tucked near the door, its pages warped from time and weather. Inside, someone has written in neat, curly script, "If you are visiting, welcome. The upright dead do not mind company." There's a doodle of a cat below it, wearing boots. You close the book and turn slowly, and you realize this building may have been the blueprint, the beginning. Because just like the graves, this church doesn't enforce direction. There's no pulpit. No one stands above the others. Everyone is equally still, equally watching. Historians still argue whether the church predated the tradition or reflected it. One theory holds that the standing graves were modeled after this circular watching space. Another insists the church layout changed because of the new burial style. That one followed the other, like a pair of old friends too polite to lead. Outside again, the light is shifting. The fog is thinner now, and you can see across the rooftops. Brown tiles, narrow chimneys, and the occasional crooked weather vane in the shape of a fox or a spoon. And from here, you can see why the church may have mattered more than just spiritually. It's the highest building in the village. Its tower casts the longest shadow at dusk, and from its bell, if the wind is just right, the sound carries to every corner of the town, even, especially, to the cemetery. Local lore holds that the bell doesn't just mark a passing, it orients the dead. "You always face the bell," one old villager was recorded saying in a 1940 interview. "So you'll know when to come back." A little eerie? Maybe. But also kind of sweet. If you're going to wake up from eternal rest, you might as well do it with directions. Some have speculated that the bell was once used to test the living as well. Legend says if it rang during a clear day, someone in the village was lying. No one ever figured out who enforced this. But the superstition was strong enough that bell maintenance was considered a sacred duty, second only to grave digging. You imagine what that job interview looked like. Can you keep secrets, fix ropes, and not spook easily? Welcome aboard. There's another tidbit, easily missed unless you've spent too long reading the margins of dusty journals. The tower was briefly struck by lightning in the early 1800s. The bell cracked, just slightly, and rang once in the middle of the night. No storm. No wind. Just a bong. Deep. Hollow. Unmistakable. 3 funerals happened that week. All natural causes. But still, historians still argue whether the crack was from lightning or poor casting. But the villagers? They sealed the crack with molten tin and never spoke of it again. The bell's voice is quiet now. But its presence? It's undeniable. It's the reason you keep glancing up as you walk through town. It's the compass needle. The invisible metronome. And maybe that's the point. In a village where the dead stand and the living seem perpetually mid-step, it makes sense that one structure, one voice, keeps time, even when nothing moves. As you walk back toward the cemetery, the path feels different. Familiar. Like you're being watched, but not judged. Just acknowledged. The air hums, the trees don't sway, and somewhere, in the distance, a bell waits for its cue. You find yourself tracing the edge of the hill again, circling slowly, almost as if drawn by an unseen rhythm. The graves are still. The town is still. But your thoughts are tumbling forward, picking up fragments of stories as you go. It's time to look beyond this valley. You see, the practice of upright burial isn't entirely unheard of in Europe, just astonishingly rare. A few scattered records speak of Celtic chieftains buried standing with their weapons, facing their enemy's territory, as if daring anyone to challenge them even after death. In one case, a Roman historian notes that a defeated general in Gaul was buried upright, naked, and painted blue. Whether this was an insult or a cultural practice is, well, unclear. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic defiance or just, frankly, very poor burial etiquette. But those were singular events. Statements. Exceptions. What makes this town different is that they did it consistently, over centuries. Not for kings, not for soldiers, but for bakers, seamstresses, children, and geese herders. That's the part that makes academics frown into their tea. You don't just invent an entirely separate burial tradition and keep it going without someone writing it down. Yet here we are. Standing room only. The best-known parallel comes from 18th century Scotland, where a particularly eccentric nobleman insisted on being buried upright in a custom-made barrel-like coffin. He wanted to defy gravity until judgment. The town reportedly used a crane to lower him into a vertical shaft, where he promptly tilted sideways, knocking over a support beam and nearly crushing the vicar's foot. So much for defiance. Elsewhere, there's the tale of a 19th century British pastor who requested to be buried standing with a Bible glued to each hand. No record confirms if this happened. What we do know is that the mortuary ran out of glue. Make of that what you will. A more serious case. In some Central African societies, vertical burial had spiritual significance, symbolizing a connection between the world of the living and the ancestors. The upright position was considered a bridge, a pillar, through which the spirit could communicate, rise, or linger. It's possible, some argue, that this little European village had been influenced by seafaring tales or missionary travelers. Or maybe not. Historians still argue whether these ideas ever made it into regional folklore, or whether the villagers just liked the look of it. Because make no mistake, from above, the cemetery forms a pattern. Each grave is set at a very slight angle. Not a grid, not chaos, but more like a sunflower field following a sun you can't see. The villagers call it the arc, and when questioned they always say the same thing. They face the light. This brings us back to the old compass rose painted on the church wall. It isn't decorative. It's not even accurate. But it marks a central point. A kind of, you are here, for both the living and the dead. A few amateur researchers, including a very enthusiastic Canadian backpacker in the 1990s, claimed that the angle of the graves aligned with the setting sun during midsummer. He also claimed the bell hummed to him in his sleep. So, grain of salt. Still, the arc is real. And it's not random. The graves don't just face the church, they arc with the land. A long, slow curve that stretches across generations. Like the cemetery itself is watching something. And that leads us to the oddest piece of all. The guest graves. Yes, guest graves. Tucked into the far corner of the hill are a few standing plots marked by names that are clearly not local, Portuguese, Polish, and one vaguely Swedish. These markers are newer, the wood less faded. And when asked, locals simply say, "Oh, they wanted to join." Some believe these were travelers who passed through and fell in love with the silence. Others think they were scholars or folklorists who grew too close to the story they were documenting. One grave simply reads, Eric. Didn't believe. Until he did. It's unclear what exactly he believed, or when, but it's one of the most visited plaques in the cemetery. People leave paper cranes, earbuds, even notes. The thing is, no one remembers when Eric arrived. There's no official record. He's just here. You let your eyes trail across the hill again. So many names, so many stories with punchlines etched into wood. Caro didn't like to sit. Leon would have preferred a hammock. Magistrates still arguing. It's funny, yes, but also oddly moving. Like they knew this tradition was strange, and they leaned into it, not with grim solemnity, but with dry humor and practical acceptance. Death comes. But here, it stands. You turn back toward the center of the cemetery and trace your steps along the curve. The breeze picks up again, brushing against your coat like a curtain being drawn aside. You look up at the gray sky, the clouds thick but not angry. And for a moment, you swear the bell hums. Not a ring, not even a full note. Just a pressure in the air, like someone clearing their throat before a story. And the story, it seems, has only just begun. You follow the curve of the cemetery until it begins to spiral back toward the older part of the village. This time, though, you notice a path you hadn't taken before. A gentle slope leading toward a grove of trees, tall and leafless, even though the season shouldn't demand it. The path is lined with short wooden stakes, each with initials etched by hand. No dates, no names, just letters. Locals call it the first row. You step carefully between the markers. The trees whisper above, though honestly, it might just be the wind running low through empty branches. At the end of the path, nestled beneath the largest tree, is a single grave unlike the rest. There's no plaque, just a post, split with age, with a faint carving barely legible in the light. You kneel to read it. The one who stood first. Historians, and we use that word loosely here, because real historians rarely publish 200-page books about single towns with no coffee shops, still argue whether this is the grave of the original upright burial. There's no date, no corroborating parish entry. But the villagers believe it. They tell the story the same way every time. There was a man. No one remembers his name. Only that he was a blacksmith's son. Tall, serious, didn't like chairs. Not for any mystical reason. He just had bad knees and claimed standing kept him alert. One day, he died young. Possibly in a smithing accident. Possibly from a chicken-related misunderstanding. Reports vary. His mother, not wanting him to be buried like others, asked the gravedigger to keep him up, like he liked. And so, they did. No ritual, no fanfare. Just a hole, a body, and 2 oak slats to keep him steady. But something about it struck a chord. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was stubbornness. But the next person who died, an elderly aunt named Lenka, asked for the same. "I always liked that boy's posture," she reportedly said. And so it began. Was that really how it started? Hard to say. But it's a better origin myth than committee decision or graves dug too narrow. You can picture it. A cluster of mourners nodding in awkward agreement. Someone muttering, "Well, I suppose we'll need stronger boots next time." Nearby, another small plaque bears no grave behind it. Just a phrase. "We remember because someone did first." This kind of memory isn't written down in books. It's whispered through routines, caught in the corners of ritual, and passed from mouth to ear, like flour from hand to dough. You won't find academic articles referencing the blacksmith's son. But if you ask anyone in the village bakery or the post office, or the woman who knits at the corner shop window every Thursday afternoon, they'll nod and say, yes, he's the one who wouldn't sit. There are other theories, of course. One dusty volume stored under a leaky ceiling in the town archive suggests the upright burial may have started as punishment. The author notes that in medieval Europe, standing burials were sometimes used for criminals, not for honor, but for public shaming, as if to display their refusal to bow even in death. But there's no record of that in this village. In fact, quite the opposite. Here, the standing dead are spoken of with affection. They're respected. The blacksmith's son, whoever he was, has no statue, no annual festival. But he does have this: a grove, a marker, and a line of graves following his example like dancers in a slow, strange waltz. You rise and look around the grove. It's quiet, even by this town's standards. Birds don't sing here. The trees don't creak. The wind, for once, doesn't know what to do with itself. And then you notice it. At the far end of the grove, past a split in the hedgerow, there's a single bench, carved from stone, slightly curved, and barely wide enough for two. On it is a metal plaque, newer than the rest. Please sit. They would have wanted you to. You do. And from this spot, you can see the cemetery in its entirety. The arc of the graves, the church tower beyond, and the gentle slope of the valley wrapping the town in a soft green cradle. It hits you suddenly how much care has gone into preserving this tradition. Not because it's flashy or profitable. Not because tourists come by the busload, they don't. But because this is who they are. A village where the dead stand. Where old jokes live on plaques. Where someone once thought, why lie down when you can keep your boots on? The sun slips further behind the clouds, casting the last stretch of afternoon into a haze of pale gold. The breeze returns, soft and indecisive. The trees shiver. And you realize, without meaning to, you've spent hours with people who haven't spoken a word. But they've told you plenty. As you leave the grove and return toward the village, your path winds past a simple 2-story brick house with white shutters and a faded green door. There's no sign, but locals know what it is. This was once the home of the town's most unusual mayor. A man remembered not for his policies, but for what he did after death. Mayor Jarek. He served in the late 1800s, a time when the outside world was getting noisier. Factories churning, railways stretching like fingers into the countryside. But here? The town stayed slow. The sheep still wandered into gardens. People still nodded instead of speaking. The bell still rang once. Jarek was an oddity from the start. Born in this very town, he left for the city in his 20s, studied administration, wore waistcoats that buttoned all the way up. And then, curiously, he came back. Said the city was too horizontal. No one was sure if he meant the architecture or the attitude. He ran for mayor unopposed, which is what usually happens in a town where no one likes campaigning. He passed a few quiet reforms, installing a new rain barrel system, repainting the church shutters, banning pie contests due to aggressive whisking. But what he's remembered for, what made him legend, was his funeral. Before he died, he left a note. Not a will. Just a single sheet of parchment left on the town clerk's desk. Stand me up. Face me toward town hall. I'd like to keep an eye on the minutes. And so they did. He was buried in full formal wear, shoes polished to a mirror shine, arms crossed lightly over a rolled-up scroll of fake budget figures. His grave was placed not in the cemetery proper, but just outside it, in a grassy knoll between the hill and the back of town hall. From that spot, he faces the office window, watching. There's even a small sundial at his feet, though it doesn't really tell time anymore. The inscription on his plaque is classic Jarek, still reviewing proposals. It's strange how beloved he became, not for greatness or bold leadership, but for his unwavering commitment to the town's eccentric dignity. People leave offerings at his grave every year on the anniversary of his re-election. Paper clips, red ink pens, the occasional pie, despite the ban. Historians visiting from bigger cities are always baffled by this. Why not return him to the cemetery? Why let him face the building like that? And the locals just shrug and say, that's what he wanted. But it goes deeper than honoring his wishes. Jarek became something of a folk symbol, a civic guardian, a reminder that even the most mundane roles, mayor, bell ringer, shoemaker, matter when done with love. His standing grave, while not unique in posture, became unique in placement. It blurred the line between the living and the buried. He's part of town life still. Once, a new clerk moved into the office overlooking Jarek's grave. She reportedly placed a curtain over the window. Within a week, the office clock stopped working. The stapler jammed. The ink dried up. Nothing supernatural, just inconvenient. The curtain was removed. Everything started working again. Historians still argue whether that story is local satire or a subtle social message about transparency in government. Either way, no one's tried covering that window since. And across the village, the mayor's grave started a quiet trend. Over time, more villagers began requesting non-traditional orientations, facing the post office, their favorite bakery, the bridge where they proposed. Not wildly scattered, but personal, subtly rebellious. It's one of those quirks that says a lot about a place. When even your final resting direction is chosen with care, not conformity. There's a kind of gentle defiance in it, as if saying, I'll leave when I'm ready. But until then, I'll be watching the sourdough rise. And really, in a world that constantly shouts for attention, maybe the greatest legacy is to be still, well-dressed, and facing exactly the spot that once made you feel alive. You walk by the town hall now, casting a glance toward the mayor's plaque, the sundial, the moss-covered shoes. The wind lifts slightly, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something faintly sweet. Maybe roasted apples or elderflower bread. The window above is open. A desk lamp glows inside. And if you didn't know better, you might believe that Mayor Jarek, standing patiently below, has some opinions about the agenda today. The road past town hall slopes gently downward, winding toward a smaller hill topped with wind-beaten poplars. A low stone wall encircles the knoll, its gate hanging slightly ajar. This is the old burial ground, still part of the cemetery, but slightly removed, as if those resting here needed just a bit more quiet. Locals call it Whisper Hill. You step through the gate. The grass here is thicker, more tangled, as though no one's quite sure if they're allowed to trim it. The graves are sparser, but unmistakably in the same upright fashion. Narrow soil mounds bulge subtly beneath each marker, giving the uncanny sense of bodies patiently standing just below the surface, arms folded, waiting. But here, the names are different. Faint. Worn to near illegibility. Only a few plaques have survived intact, and they bear the softest, most poetic inscriptions. Ina. Heard the wind speak first. Sybil. Asked the hill to remember her. Clem. Dreamt with his eyes open. These aren't epitaphs exactly. They're messages. Little whispers from a world that refused to leave quietly. According to town legend, Whisper Hill is where the listening graves are buried. That is, if you believe the stories, these were the villagers who claimed to hear the dead. Not mediums or mystics, just ordinary people who, late at night, could hear names whispered in the wind. Not all the time. Not always clearly. But often enough that they took it seriously. No one knows how this idea started. There are no written records detailing any official belief in after-death communication. But oral tradition in the village treats it as fact. Some folks just kept listening, they say. And that's where the wind comes in. Stand on Whisper Hill when the valley wind shifts, and only when it shifts, and you'll hear it. A soft thread of sound that almost forms words. Locals don't encourage visitors to try. Not out of fear, but out of courtesy. The wind's not speaking to you, they say. It's not your name being said. But some people insist otherwise. One woman, in a 1956 interview preserved in the parish library's creaky reel-to-reel archives, recalls being a child and standing by her grandmother's grave on Whisper Hill. The wind picked up, and for a moment, she heard her own name, spoken not in her grandmother's voice, but in her own. Like I was already remembering myself, she said. Which, honestly, is a bit much for a sleepy cemetery. But it does make for a good shiver. Historians still argue whether the so-called whispering effect is just an acoustic trick caused by the wind funneling between the hills and the tight arrangement of wooden markers. One acoustician theorized that the vertical graves, spaced just so, could act like a natural resonance chamber. The sound of the breeze bouncing off uneven wood and stone, producing patterns that mimic speech. That theory gained traction until someone pointed out, it only happens at certain graves, never all. And never when someone tries to record it, which, is exactly the sort of thing ghosts would insist on. Still, the idea of graves that listen, and perhaps respond, has embedded itself deeply into the culture here. Families often visit Whisper Hill not to mourn, but to converse. They bring small benches, sit in silence, then leave with a nod, as if they'd just finished a meeting with an old friend. One fringe theory, proposed by an elderly bell ringer in the 1980s, claimed that the names whispered in the wind were always names of people not yet dead, that the upright dead were calling others to join them, not with menace, but with companionship. They're building a village over there, he said, and they miss their favorites. When asked who they'd be calling next, he'd always grin and say, "Not me. I'm a terrible neighbor." You move deeper into the hill's curve, and notice that some graves are grouped together, clustered like families at a dinner table. Some even appear to be facing each other, upright bodies aligned as if in perpetual conversation. A few plaques have handwritten notes nailed beside them, laminated against the weather. "Grandfather, I finally tried your bread recipe. Maud, I saw a fox today and thought of you. Still haven't forgiven you, Eric, but I'll let it rest." It's hard not to feel the weight of presence here. Not heaviness exactly, just awareness. You're not alone. You're being observed with the kind of gentle curiosity you might give a cat in your chair, or a neighbor's child reciting a poem slightly too loud. The poplars sway above you. The wind circles your collar. And then, only for a second, you swear you hear it. Not a voice, not your name. Just a soft vowel sound, caught in the air, like someone starting to speak, but it's gone. And maybe it was never there. Still, You walk back down the hill a little slower. Maybe out of respect. Or maybe, deep down, you don't want to miss your own name if it comes again. The wind hums behind you, and the graves, those tall, still neighbors, listen without judgment. You step back onto the village path, boots brushing through the gravel as twilight thickens around the rooftops. Lamps flicker on behind windows now. Soft yellow glows like fireflies trapped in glass. But you're not ready to go inside. Not yet. Because just across the main lane, beside the old bakery, now long closed but still smelling faintly of yeast and burnt sugar, you see a grave planted directly in front of a door. The sign above it is barely hanging on. The letters spell out, Cloek and Son, shoes repaired while you wait, though the R has fallen sideways and now leans awkwardly, like it's waiting to be picked up and set straight. This was the home and shop of Joseph Cloek, the village cobbler for nearly 50 years. And yes, he's still standing there. His grave is unlike the others. It's shorter, set into cobblestone, and instead of a wooden plaque, his marker is carved into a polished shoe form, the kind used to shape leather soles. It's a lovely piece of craftsmanship, if a bit macabre. At its base, someone has scratched with a blade. Still takes appointments. He is, according to legend, the only person in the village buried not in a field or on a hill, but directly in front of his own shop door. Why? Because he requested it, of course. I want to greet my customers, he wrote in his will, even if I can't fix their souls anymore. Yes. Souls. The pun wasn't lost on anyone. For decades, people walked around the marker, stepping respectfully off the path to avoid it. Children would wave. Some swore they saw the grave tilt, ever so slightly, toward passing shoes that needed mending. No one complained. After all, Joseph had shod most of them. But what makes his story especially charming is the boots. 3 days before he died, peacefully, in his own kitchen over a lukewarm cup of tea, he polished his best boots, tied them tight, and told his son, "They'll need to shine in the rain. Don't cheap out on the wax." Sure enough, when he was lowered, upright, as expected, he wore those boots. They were hand-stitched, calf leather, with soles reinforced by copper nails. By all accounts, they've held up remarkably well. Every 10 years, someone checks them. Quietly. At night. Just to make sure they're still holding. Historians still argue whether the 10-year check is part of some real tradition, or if it's just something teenagers invented to justify sneaking out past curfew. Either way, the boots are still there. Untouched. Upright. And next to the grave is a small wooden bench. Not fancy, just 3 planks and 2 nails. But every so often someone leaves a shoe. A real shoe. Sometimes polished, sometimes scuffed. Always alone. A silent tribute. And no one takes them. There's a story, a gentle one, that when the village floods, and it does every so often, the only shop that stays dry is Joseph's. The water creeps up the streets, washes through gardens, soaks the edge of the cemetery, but it always seems to veer away from the cobbler's door. People say it's because of the boots, because he's still standing there, protecting the souls inside. And if that doesn't warm your toes, nothing will. Of course, there's another story. One a little more peculiar. An old woman named Ludka, who lived next door, claimed she once saw footprints appear during a thunderstorm. Wet, muddy prints across the stone path in front of the shop. Not approaching it. Leaving it. And then, the next morning, her shoes, left on the stoop to dry, were mysteriously repaired. She never explained it. Only said, Joseph hated sloppy stitching. Even now, he can't let it go. You chuckle. A little nervous, maybe. But also oddly comforted. Because if you think about it, there's something profoundly human about the idea of fixing what's broken, even when you're gone. Of standing guard over your craft. Of watching your neighbors pass by in shoes you once touched. And maybe, just maybe, reaching out now and then with a polished rag and a grumble. That's the thing about this town. The dead don't haunt. They help. Quietly. Persistently. Upright. You sit on the bench for a while, facing the little cobbler's grave. The wind picks up again, tugging softly at your sleeves. A bell rings once in the distance. Not from the church, but from the bakery next door. An old service bell someone must have nudged. Or maybe not. Either way, you look down at your own feet. Your shoes are worn, scuffed around the heel, damp at the edges. Nothing too serious. But still, you find yourself standing a little straighter as you walk away, just in case Joseph is watching. Evening settles over the village like a heavy wool blanket, soft, quiet, and a little scratchy. The lamps along the main lane now glow more confidently, casting golden puddles onto cobbled paths. Somewhere in the distance, a kettle whistles faintly, followed by the unmistakable creak of someone sitting in an old wooden chair. You find yourself drawn to the far edge of the cemetery again, this time to an area nicknamed the Tilt. It's not a part most visitors notice right away. There's no signage, no path leads to it directly. But as you follow a subtle dip in the grass, you start to feel it, the way the earth seems to lean, ever so slightly, towards something. It's almost imperceptible, but enough to unsettle your inner ear. And that's when you see them. A tight cluster of 6 graves, upright, of course, but each slightly turned, twisted just a few degrees to the side, as though they'd shifted in their sleep. Some lean left, others lean back. One has a plaque that now faces the wrong direction entirely, showing its inscription to a thistle bush instead of the footpath. This, according to whispered village lore, is where things got weird. The story goes that one summer, sometime in the late 1800s, after a particularly wet and windy storm, villagers noticed a grave had turned. Not fallen over, just rotated, slowly, as though on a lazy carousel. The gravedigger, naturally, was blamed. He denied any involvement, swore up and down that the grave had been set firm, braced properly, and packed tight. But 2 days later, a second grave shifted. Then another. Until all 6 had gently turned, like dancers forgetting their choreography. No one panicked. This isn't the kind of town that panics. But there was murmuring. A few folks tried to straighten the markers. Others suggested leaving them alone. If they want a different view, who are we to argue? One woman reportedly said while trimming her lavender hedge. Historians, of course, love this. One camp blames poor soil conditions, something about freeze-thaw cycles causing the ground to move in slow spirals. Another camp insists the tilting is a result of magnetic anomalies from underground iron deposits, which sounds fancy until you remember. This theory came from a retired cartographer with one working eye and a personal vendetta against compasses. And then there's the theory no one likes to say out loud. The graves turned themselves. Not maliciously, not violently, just gradually. Like the buried changed their minds, or heard something, or felt something in the wind and pivoted to face it. No one knows exactly what they turned toward. Some say it's the hill, others, the river bend. A few point to a specific chimney on the edge of town, one that's been bricked over for as long as anyone can remember. Whatever the case, the tilt was never corrected. The graves remain at their odd angles, and now, locals avoid planting anything near them, just in case. You approach the nearest one, its wooden plaque now nearly perpendicular to the others. The name reads, Irina. Had questions. Never got answers. Another nearby simply says, Phallic. Turned once. Might again. And in the center, a slightly taller marker bears no name at all. Just a single line carved deeply into the wood. Looking elsewhere now. You feel your spine tingle. Not with fear, but with something gentler. The kind of prickling you get when someone stands just behind you and doesn't say a word. It's strange, isn't it? How even in death, the desire to reposition, to see differently, remains. These weren't great philosophers or explorers. They were ordinary people. But perhaps that's the point. Maybe curiosity doesn't die with the body. Maybe it just reorients. Some villagers still believe that if you visit the tilt during a certain week in late October, after the last harvest, but before the frost, the graves will move again. Just a few degrees. Enough to make you question your memory. People leave compasses now. Notebooks. A few place toys spinning tops on the earth, watching to see which direction they fall. It's become a quiet ritual. One boy reportedly visited every day for a month, drawing chalk outlines around the grave bases to track movement. The chalk would fade, of course. But he swore, on a stack of overdue library books, that 2 of the graves changed angle by 3 degrees over 10 days. He's now the village librarian. And yes, his desk faces west, toward the tilt. As night settles, the temperature drops. A soft mist creeps across the lower cemetery, curling like a cat between the markers. You stand quietly among the 6 tilted graves, breathing slow, letting the dampness settle on your jacket. You try not to blink, just in case something shifts when you're not looking. But nothing moves. Not yet. Still, you can't help but glance back over your shoulder as you leave, because this is a town that doesn't forget where you stood, or how you stood. And sometimes even now the dead reconsider. The dead. You leave the tilt with your hands in your pockets and your thoughts turning, slowly, just like the graves behind you. As the final edge of twilight fades into the cool indigo of night, you realize something both comforting and peculiar. The village doesn't sleep in the way other places do. It softens, it hushes, but it doesn't stop, and neither do its stories. You pass by a narrow alley behind the old schoolhouse, long since abandoned but still upright. Of course it is. Its walls are bowed slightly, like they're listening. The roof is missing a few tiles, and ivy curls lazily through a crack in the bell tower, yet it stands firm against time. This was once the heart of the village's orientation traditions, a custom older than anyone living now. It wasn't just the dead who stood tall. The living were trained to do it too. Every child here learned from an early age how to stand. Posture mattered, not for discipline, not for appearance, but for presence. Teachers didn't say, "Sit up straight." They said, "Stand so you can be remembered," which is a bit much for 7-year-olds, but surprisingly poetic in context. Graduation ceremonies were held outdoors, in front of the cemetery, not facing the students' families, but facing the graves. The idea was simple. Before going out into the world, you acknowledge those who never left. And this wasn't some somber moment of silence. It was more like a town-wide nod. "We see you. Thanks for making space." Some students would even whisper things to specific graves. "I'll try baking the way you did." Or, "I still don't like the library carpet, but I'll miss it." It was, in its way, a rite of passage, both personal and communal. One record from the 1920s, written in the wobbly cursive of a schoolmistress named Eloise, describes a young girl named Brina who refused to attend her own ceremony, unless her great-aunt's grave was awake. No one knew what that meant. Brina wouldn't explain. But the night before graduation, villagers swore they heard a soft thump from the old aunt's plot. Brina attended. She passed. No one asked questions. Historians still argue whether this was just village theater, a kind of shared storytelling to ease transitions. But if it was, they've stuck to it impressively. You'd think someone would have filmed one of these ceremonies by now. But phones don't seem to work properly here. GPS maps show the town, sure, but never the cemetery. It's just a blank patch of green. No matter the angle, no matter the update. Back on the main road, you pass a storefront that once sold travel goods. It's long closed, and now filled with jars of buttons, wind-up toys, and half-knitted scarves no one's claimed. But in the display window, there's a wooden cutout of a standing man. Not fancy, just arms at his sides, chin slightly raised, like a coat rack with confidence. Pinned to his chest is a note that reads, "Try standing still for a while. It might teach you more than walking ever will." You smile. It's hard not to. Because this whole place is steeped in a kind of upright philosophy. Not loud, not moralizing, just there. Present. Solid. People here may not run marathons, but they know how to linger. And in a world that's always moving, sometimes it's the stillness that gets remembered. That's what makes the orientation of the graves so special. It's not just posture, it's perspective. Most cemeteries line graves in neat rows, uniform and forward-facing, like soldiers waiting for inspection. Here, each grave has a purpose, a direction. a story behind the angle. Sometimes literal, sometimes emotional. One widow buried her husband standing toward the bakery they'd never gotten to open. Another chose to face the river because her son loved the sound of water. A teenager, gone too soon, was buried with his face toward the sky. No marker, just a star painted on the soil, which fades and is redrawn by someone every spring. No one knows who does it. There's even a peculiar section at the edge of the cemetery where the graves form a spiral. A slow, gentle curl that winds inward toward a central point where there's nothing. No marker. No post. Just a small patch of clover and a carved stone that reads, "This is not the end." And it isn't. Not really. Because orientation isn't about finality. It's about choice. The choice to face what matters. To stay present, even when motion ends. You pause at the spiral's edge. The air feels different here. Not heavy, but dense. As if sound would echo, if there were any to make. And then you hear it. Not a voice, not a whisper. Just a breath. Your own. And it sounds steady. You retrace your steps now, leaving the spiral behind, though part of you feels like it's still turning slowly inward. Like the momentum of the idea hasn't quite stopped. The path brings you back to the low ridge above the town, and from here you can see the whole sleepy sprawl. Rooftops stacked like books too tired to shelve themselves, lamplit windows flickering like thought bubbles, and the church tower slicing the sky in its usual calm, supervisory way. You blink, and for a moment, everything looks perfectly still. But of course, nothing ever really is. Especially not in this town. Because here's where things get complicated, or, depending on your mood, deliciously strange. Not long ago, an archaeology team was granted reluctant permission to do a limited survey of the cemetery's older edge, the part nearest the river, where graves lean just a little more than you'd expect, and the grass never grows quite right. The villagers weren't thrilled about it. "They've already settled in," one old man said, "so maybe don't go poking them." But the team came anyway. And they dug, carefully, respectfully, with brushes and cameras and terms like subsurface anomalies. What they found? Well, depends who you ask. The official report says they uncovered 5 standing graves, all oriented perfectly vertical, bones intact, shoes present, leather, worn, still faintly stitched. But there was something odd about the depth. The graves were deeper than expected, by nearly a meter. Enough that the top of the skull rested well below ground level, meaning that even if the plaque was placed where it should have been, it wouldn't mark the head at all. Just the chest. In short, the graves were too deep for standing burials. So the team remeasured, double-checked, ran soil compaction tests. But no mistake had been made. The ground itself had either shifted drastically, or the graves had been dug that way on purpose. Why? Historians still argue whether this was a miscalculation, a symbolic statement, or something more unsettling. One fringe theory. The bodies weren't buried vertically at all. They moved. That's right. Moved. Skeptical? So was the team. Until 2 days later, their excavation pit caved in. Nothing dramatic, no lightning, no screaming. Just a slow, deliberate slump in the soil, like the earth was exhaling after holding its breath too long. One archaeologist twisted an ankle. Another refused to return. The lead researcher, who swore the instruments had been tampered with, left the profession entirely and now runs a quiet cafe in Lisbon. Of course, the villagers took it all with mild amusement. "They've never liked being measured," the baker's son said. "You start counting, and they start shifting." And he might have been joking. Maybe. But what came next wasn't funny. After the dig, 3 plaques in the oldest section of the cemetery were found reversed. Names turned toward the ground. No sign of tampering. No footprints. No wind damage. Just turned. Quietly. As if the dead had decided to take their anonymity back. From then on, the town has refused any further digs. The graveyard is off limits to researchers now. Even metal detectors are discouraged. "Let them be," the librarian says. "If they want to be found, they'll let you know." This passive resistance has made the village a kind of folkloric Bermuda Triangle for certain academics, especially the sort who wear tweed with elbow patches and speak only in footnotes. One even published a paper titled "The Rebellious Dead: Passive Aggression in Unexcavated European Burials." It was not well received, possibly because the journal it appeared in no longer exists. As for the villagers, they still visit the graves, still leave their offerings, still speak softly when passing certain markers. But they don't treat the cemetery like a place of sorrow. It's more like an old friend who needs their space, who will share stories if you sit long enough but gets annoyed if you show up with measuring tape. And here's something strange, just a little thing. Every map of the village, the official ones, the handmade ones, even the digital ones printed from drone scans, shows a small blank space in the cemetery's southeast corner, like a shadow that never quite develops. You ask the clerk at the post office about it. He shrugs. "Oh, that's the place that won't be drawn," he says, as if that's the most normal thing in the world. Some spaces just prefer privacy. He's not wrong, because when you walk that direction, you feel it. Not dread, not fear, just subtle resistance, a soft static in the soles of your feet, like the ground is saying, "Not tonight." And you respect that. Because in this village, even the earth has boundaries. And the dead? They're not trying to escape. They're just trying to stay upright, to face what they chose to face. And maybe, now and then, to shift a little, just to keep things interesting. You head back toward the center of town now, the gravel path crunching softly under your feet, each step echoing just a little longer than it should in the night air. It's fully dark now, but not black. This town doesn't do pitch black. There's always just enough glow, a lantern on a porch, a candle in a bakery window, the flicker of a coal stove behind lace curtains, to keep the shadows respectful. You pass a stone bench carved into the wall of a narrow alley. It's unmarked, save for the faint outline of a figure etched into the backrest. No name, just the suggestion of someone standing, arms at their side, staring calmly into the cobblestone. And that's when you remember the seventh grave. Earlier, back in the tilt, you saw 6 graves shifted. But the legends always spoke of 7. The last one is missing. Or maybe it isn't. Because tucked behind the tailor's shop, down a side path overgrown with rosemary and old receipts, there's a plot that doesn't appear on any map. No plaque, no fence, just a circle of standing stones, 12 in total, with a patch of gravel at the center, and a single pair of worn men's boots set directly in the middle. Not buried, just standing there. Locals call it the absent grave. It's not a real grave per se. There's no body beneath it, no ceremony. And yet, it's treated with the same reverence as every other plot. People leave notes in the boots, bits of bread, spare buttons. One girl even left a copy of her report card, which earned her a solid B in geography and a mysterious cinnamon bun that appeared on her windowsill the next morning. No one speaks of who the grave is for. Some say it's reserved, for a future mayor, or for a traveler who never returns, or for someone whose name has been forgotten, but whose place remains. Others think the boots belong to a man who outlived his own burial, and now walks the village at night, checking the angles of the graves and whispering their names back into alignment. And then there's the theory that chills just a little deeper, that the boots are for you. That when you visit, stand in them, even for a moment. The dead take your measure. Not to claim you, just to see if you're ready to listen. You don't step into the boots. You think about it. You imagine the leather creaking softly beneath your weight, the cold rush of inherited stillness rising up your spine. But not tonight. Instead, you sit quietly on the low stone beside the circle. Let the night wrap around you like a thick scarf. In the distance, the bell tower doesn't ring, but something about its silhouette makes you feel observed in the best way. Like a friend who won't interrupt your thoughts but is there if you need a second cup of tea. Behind you, the tailor's shop hums softly, even though no one's there. And that's the oddest thing about this town. You're never alone, even when you're absolutely, definitely, physically alone. The silence here isn't empty. It's populated, stacked high with memory and motionless attention. You walk slowly back toward the main road, passing houses with windows shut, doorways swept, boots neatly aligned outside like a code. In one window, you see a single candle flickering beside a framed photograph. It shows a woman standing beside her own grave marker, grinning. The caption scrawled beneath in looping ink, "Getting a feel for the view." You smile again, because the more you see, the more you understand. This town isn't afraid of death, not even mildly spooked. If anything, it's curated death like an art gallery, arranged with taste, humor, and a surprising level of civic planning. Take, for instance, the municipal directory. Not the living one, the other one. Yes, there's a full ledger, kept in the town clerk's office, titled The Upright Registry. Every standing grave has an entry. Not just name and date, but orientation. Facing west toward the Willow Grove. Tilted 14 degrees toward the soup market. One even says, facing nowhere in particular, just like the breeze. The registry isn't legally binding. No one enforces anything. But they keep it updated. Carefully. Lovingly. Even adding new footnotes when needed. Plaque replaced after pigeon incident. Shoes confirmed intact, April 3rd. And most importantly, still standing. Because that's the only line that matters. No great philosophies. No afterlife guarantees. Just the quiet promise that when the time comes, someone will stand you up straight, smooth your coat, dust your boots, and turn you toward whatever view you choose. Even if that view is the bakery, or a crooked chimney, or the sky. You stroll now without urgency, letting the road guide you instead of the other way around. There's a softness to the town at this hour, as if it exhales once the world isn't watching. The stones beneath your feet seem warmer, like they've stored up stories from the day and are whispering them back into the soles of your shoes. You pass the blacksmith's old cottage, long cold, but with a fresh horseshoe hanging from the eaves. No one claims to have put it there. It simply appeared one spring morning, polished, upright, nailed carefully into place. It's small acts like that which define this village. Not grand monuments, not loud parades, just 1,000 tiny upright gestures. You round a corner and pause in front of a peculiar sight. A series of narrow graves, tightly spaced, their markers unusually plain. Only initials. No dates. No symbols. And all tilted, deliberately, backward. Leaning away from the others, like dancers caught mid-bow. This section is called the Quiet Line. It's the resting place of those who didn't want to be known. No scandal, no shame, just preference. Villagers say the people buried here lived small, deliberate lives. The type who watered their neighbors' plants without being asked. Who knew the name of every stray cat. Who made soups too large for their own kitchens and left portions on doorsteps, always anonymously. When they passed, they requested little. No sermon, one note read. No poems. Just make sure my buttons are straight. And so, the Quiet Line was created. A shaded corner of the cemetery, framed by elder trees in silence. No flowers here, only pebbles. Smooth ones. Left on top of each plaque. Each pebble a thank you, a memory, or simply an acknowledgement. You stop at one of the graves, initials faint, E.T. At its base is a small ceramic cup, half buried in the moss, filled with thimbles. Must be 24 of them. Each one slightly different. Some hand-painted, some bent, some chipped. You wonder if E.T. was a tailor, or a collector, or someone who simply liked holding small metal things. And that's the beauty of it. You'll never know. But the offering remains. You move on, past the line of tilting graves, and find yourself drawn to a small garden enclosed by low stone walls. Tomatoes in one corner, herbs in another. But what catches your attention are the scarecrows. There are 4 of them. Dressed not in rags or burlap, but in real clothes. A green cardigan, a yellow raincoat. A pair of brown corduroy trousers so neatly pressed it's almost rude. No one talks much about these scarecrows, but they're dressed with care, maintained, refreshed seasonally. A sort of second wardrobe for the dead, you suspect. One wears a sign around its neck. He liked the view from here. Another simply has borrowed time, returned upright. There's something gently theatrical about it, like the villagers are playing at resurrection without the drama, just to keep things from getting too heavy. It's hard to explain, but in a town where death is tidy, the scarecrows feel like punctuation marks, commas instead of periods. You sit for a while near the garden wall, your back against the stone, the scent of rosemary thick in the air. You hear someone sweeping 2 streets over. You hear a dog's tags jingle once, then fade. And above all that, you hear the stillness. Not silence. Stillness. The kind that isn't empty, but full of intention. You think again about the shoes, how so many here are buried in them. Not ornate, not ceremonial, just theirs. The ones they walked in, danced in, stood in, for however many years it took. One theory claims the shoes were meant to confuse spirits who might try to claim the dead before their time. That upright burial with footwear made it harder to tell who'd passed and who was just resting with impressive posture. But most believe it was simpler than that. Shoes are for journeys, even when you don't plan to walk, especially when you don't. The villagers here may not expect to rise from their graves, but if called, they want to be ready. Laced up, standing tall, facing forward, or wherever they chose. It's a kind of hope, really. Not in an afterlife necessarily, but in the act of remaining, being part of the town, even when breath is gone, still participating, still standing, like an old friend at the edge of a gathering, listening without needing to speak. You close your eyes, and for a moment, the whole village feels like it's breathing in time with you. You rise slowly from the garden wall, brushing a bit of moss from your jacket sleeve, and begin your final walk for the evening. The path bends gently through the sleeping town, past shuttered windows and doorsteps lined with empty mugs, tea long gone cold, but still respectfully left for whatever visitor might pass in the night. Ahead, you see the main square. Modest, circular, bordered by stone buildings that lean ever so slightly inward, like conspirators keeping secrets. In the center stands a large oak, bare now, its branches a quiet skeleton against the sky, but wrapped in strings of small paper charms fluttering softly. You approach. The tree is surrounded by a ring of low stones, seats, maybe, or altars, or simply the right place to pause. Each stone bears a carved word: listen, remember, stand, wait, face. At the base of the oak is a metal plate, dulled with age. We stand together, even when we fall alone. You sit on one of the stones and exhale slowly. It's quieter now than it's ever been. Not a single breeze. Not even the distant cough of an old chimney. Just stillness. Not vacant, but watchful. From here you can see the cemetery again, the gentle hill just visible under the starlight. It looks like it always has. Serene, odd, full of intent. The upright dead don't move. They never have. Or maybe they do, and they're just very good at timing. There's something profoundly peaceful about knowing they're still there. Not rising, not wandering, just being. Each one facing something they loved, or feared, or simply wished to witness a little longer. The standing burials weren't a rebellion. They weren't a threat. They were a statement, quiet, patient, and mildly cheeky. Because, let's be honest, there's a kind of dry humor in this whole tradition. It's like the town is saying, we know what happens to everyone eventually, but must we lie down to do it? And maybe it's that spirit, the calm defiance, the affection for small absurdities, that holds the village together. Not superstition, not fear, but love, wrapped in routine, spiced with a wink. Take the bell, for example. You can't hear it right now, but you know it's there, waiting, like everything else. If you ask the villagers, they'd tell you they don't listen for it anymore. They feel it. The way you feel someone enter a room without looking up. The way you know rain's coming before the clouds show. It's presence, not noise. And the bell? It doesn't judge. It just keeps time. You remember something from the registry. The line they use when a grave is added, after the direction is chosen, and the name is inked into the leather-bound book. They don't write interred. They don't write deceased. They write upright and settled. That's it. No flowery eulogies, no theological deep dives, just a status update. One that means more here than 100 marble monuments somewhere else. You take one last slow look around the square. The oak tree, the church spire, the barely glowing bakery sign, the flickering candle in the cobbler's window, and the hill. Still. Quiet. Watching. You smile without meaning to. Because here, being remembered isn't about noise or legacy. It's about orientation, about facing the right thing, and doing it long enough that someone notices, even if it takes 100 years, even if you never move again. So now, as you rest in your bed, eyes soft, limbs heavy, heart quieted, imagine the village growing darker with you. The windows dim, the cobblestones cool, the bell in the tower silent but solid. Imagine the hill, those gentle mounds, one by one, settling deeper into stillness. The names on their plaques, half faded, whispering to the breeze that's barely there. No hurry, no fear, just waiting. Upright and settled. The shoes remain laced, the boots remain brushed. Each soul not gone, just steady. You feel it, don't you? That peculiar comfort of knowing they're still there. Not watching in a haunting way, but in the way grandparents used to sit at the edge of the porch. Hands folded, eyes half closed, just present. The town does not fade.